What was it like moving to New Zealand versus Australia? Personally, it was a very different experience. On one hand, I moved to New Zealand by myself when I was younger. In comparison, I moved to Australia with my husband and daughter in my early 30s. So my personal situation and preferences were very different. New Zealand and Australia, although similar in some contexts, as a country to live in, they are also very different. More on that later. But first, welcome to the Little Cup from New Zealand to Australia, where we talk about moving abroad must-knows. I am your host, Binibining Veronica. If you are a first-time listener, I share my experience living overseas to help you prepare for your big move. So if you are moving to New Zealand or Australia and you want to plan better, please hit like and subscribe. Salamat po! New Zealand. I first heard about New Zealand when I was still living in the Philippines. To give you some context, I was born and raised in a military camp in the Philippines. I studied nursing when I was 15 years old and eventually became a registered nurse. During that time, I had classmates who were thinking of working overseas. Some had actually already moved to Singapore, Middle East, USA, and Australia. But I was uncertain where to go or even if I really wanted to work overseas. Eventually, after weighing the pros and cons, the opportunity to work abroad became more enticing. I applied for my New Zealand nursing registration and booked a one-way ticket to New Zealand to complete a competence assessment program. I was 21 years old then, and the experience was very nerve-wracking. I didn't really know much about New Zealand, and full disclosure, I don't think I ever saw New Zealand in the world map during my time as a student. I didn't know how to become a registered nurse abroad. I didn't even think it was possible to work abroad even though I have my Philippine nursing license. I wasn't sure of the process, so I did end up using a consultancy agency to help with my application. Don't get me wrong, I had access to internet back in 2010, back when I was doing my research. However, I had to physically go to a computer shop, pay for half an hour access, and research as much as I can in that limited time. I had a phone, but it's pretty much for call and text, and we didn't have broadband at home. YouTube 13 years ago was also very different. We didn't have access to vlogs or podcasts, so reliable information about how to become a registered nurse in New Zealand, well, it's not as easily accessible. So here I was, ready for my first ever flight. I had my passport with my New Zealand visa. I had details of my school and accommodation. I had one check-in luggage and a carry-on bag, and I said goodbye to my father, my mom, and my brother. I think my sister was at home with my grandma, but I remember not knowing what to feel. Uncertain where to look, how long to hug, and at the back of my head, unsure if this was in fact the right decision. I said goodbye to everything I knew up until then and to the people who loved me the most. I was very scared of the actual airport experience. I have heard some bad experiences with IOs in the airport, and it was my first time flying as well. But fortunately, I was flying with another nurse who used the same consultancy agency. The agency connected us, so we had each other's number prior, and we met in the airport lounge. He was a very good kuya throughout the journey. He gave me sandwich and bottled water before our flight, and during our flight, he woke me up when it's time to eat. I was also wearing a sticker to show that it was my first time flying, so I got on the plane first and left the plane last. It was a special experience. On arrival at Auckland Airport, I've met other nurses from the same agency. There was a total of 6 of us, and together we rode a shuttle from Auckland to Rotorua. I don't remember much of the journey, but I do remember being cold and the travel being long. Each time I wake up, there's just greenery everywhere. Green trees, shrubs, just green. I was green. I didn't exactly know how to begin my new life abroad, how to set things up, what to go, and where to get it. Fortunately, the caretaker of the accommodation we were staying at was also from the Philippines. She took us to the mall, showed us where to convert our Philippine peso to New Zealand dollars. We bought SIM cards for our phones. She showed us where to get dinner. And my mind was truly blown on how expensive that Big Mac meal was. The trick, she said, was to never convert. We ended up eating my first ever budget Chinese takeaway, and back in our accommodation, we were also shown how to connect to the internet. We did have to pay extra for this, and she showed us how to use the on-site pay-per-use washing machine. The next day, another nurse who used the same consultancy agency arrived, and the 7 of us had a quick tour of the CBD. We opened a bank account, got our debit cards, walked a little bit, and prepared ourselves for the first 2 weeks of theoretical class. Within our class, there were other international nurses. There were some from India, and there were also other Filipino nurses who have been in New Zealand for much longer than us. There were also 2 Kiwi nurses in our class who have been out of practice for over 5 years, so they had to complete the competence assessment program. It was a very diverse group. The theoretical session was pretty much like sitting in a class where you are studying nursing, but the discussion is more of a review of the concepts that we already learned previously because, after all, we are registered nurses in our home country. But of course, there was emphasis on what it's like to actually work as a nurse in Aotearoa, New Zealand. For our clinical placement, our little group of 7 Filipino nurses were actually assigned to different towns. However, we managed to ask our education provider if we can stay in the same town so that we can be in the same accommodation. In the end, we secured clinical placements in 3 different aged care facilities within the same town. So we ended up staying in the same accommodation. This time, it was a homestay arrangement. The house was owned by a Filipino woman and her Kiwi husband. From memory, I think they had 3 extra rooms, so myself and 3 other girls stayed in one room, and then 2 boys in another room. Now, I am not sure if my memory is correct, but I think someone got to stay in a room by himself. By the way, if you are enjoying this podcast, please hit subscribe and turn on your notification bell so you will know when I upload new podcasts just like this one. And if you want to support the channel, click that super thanks icon or simply buy me a coffee by clicking the link below. And that link is buymeacoffee.com/binibining_ver. Alternatively, a big thumbs up also goes a long way. Salamat po! I think I have previously shared some photos in my YouTube videos where I talk more about my CAP experience, and I have also shared some old photos in my Facebook page, Binibining Veronica. My all-time favorite photo during this time was sitting with the girls just working on our competence assessment form because I didn't really know what to expect about CAP and the writing skills required to complete the competence assessment form, but you get through it in the end. In the end, I finished CAP and we were just waiting for our NZRN license, and then it was time to say goodbye yet again. I was at the bus stop preparing for my goodbyes when one of my CAP classmates said, "You will have to say many goodbyes. You'll find your first job in New Zealand and then you'll move on to another one. You'll probably stay in New Zealand or you may move somewhere else. That is just part of life, saying goodbye." Now, let's call this CAP classmate Nurse Brain. I'm not sure if I'll talk more about my CAP classmate in these episodes, but for the purpose of this storytelling, let's call him Nurse Brain, and that's what he said, and I've always remembered it. Now, another classmate chipped in. Let's call her Nurse Glasses. She said that apparently you can convert your New Zealand nurse license to Australian registered nurse license, and maybe in the future, that's something that we can do. Maybe. I said goodbye to Nurse Brain, Glasses, No Glasses, Big Luggage, Kuya Nurse, and Nurse America. The last one ended up moving back to the Philippines and then eventually to US. I said my goodbyes and I remember the clinical placement I went to. I ended up meeting the maintenance person in that aged care facility and he offered me a room to rent in their house. So I moved there while I was waiting for my nursing license, and when I got a job in the same town, I stayed there for a little over a year before moving to another accommodation in a similar rent-to-room/flatmate situation. It took 12 months worth of pay before I actually repaid my debt for my New Zealand nursing application and registration, and it felt really good to eventually pay it off. I first got a job in an aged care facility, then I became a New Zealand resident, I traveled a bit locally, I changed job and moved to a public hospital, won a Reader's Digest competition, I eventually learned how to drive, bought my first car, and I completed a postgraduate degree. I then got a job in a senior designated role. I got married, bought our first home, became a New Zealand citizen. I completed a master's degree. We welcomed our daughter. I started a YouTube channel. I had a major surgery, got a World Health Organization nomination, bought an investment property. And just like that, 10 years has passed. What was it like moving to New Zealand? It was scary. I was young and inexperienced. I knew very little about New Zealand and what it's like working as an immigrant. But it was exciting. I was meeting new people from different culture. At one point, I shared a house with Kiwis, Vietnamese, Malaysian Chinese, Indians, and a few from Germany and Czech Republic. It was sad. I missed home, my family, my very few friends. There were times when it felt like they have all moved on and were creating new memories and experiences without me. I have also lost loved ones, my grandmothers and my aunt, and I didn't had a chance to be physically back in the Philippines. But it was happy. I've met my first boyfriend turned husband, and together we made a family. I've made new friends, still few, but enough. It was expensive. Every time I needed to do something for my New Zealand application, there's a fee to pay. The cost of living in New Zealand is also expensive. It was expensive for me as a single person trying to support myself and save a little, and it was still expensive yet again as a couple trying to provide for our small family. It was priceless. New Zealand is a beautiful place. You must visit. The people, the culture, and the environment, it is absolutely breathtaking. The laid-back culture, work-life balance, the friendly attitude, instantly you are welcomed. I have to admit, I became friendlier while living in New Zealand compared to when I was living in the Philippines. I am not exactly sure why. It was scary, it was exciting, it was sad, it was happy, it was expensive, it was priceless, and then it was time to go again. What was it like moving to Australia? Is it really hot in Australia? Have you seen spiders and snakes? What about racism? Some people I know who went to Australia actually moved back to New Zealand. They don't treat New Zealanders as well as Australians get treated in New Zealand, right? For me, I got my Australian registered nurse license in 2015, but I stayed in New Zealand for another 7 years. Like I said, overall, I lived a happy life in New Zealand. I actually once told my coworker that my worst day in New Zealand was still a better day compared to what it was like for me in the Philippines. I was living a simple life in New Zealand, but I was happy. However, financially, it made sense for our family to try our luck in Australia. My husband is also a registered nurse, but even though he was working full-time, 40 hours a week, and I was working in a senior designated role as a nurse specialist, then eventually as a nurse educator, it was still a bit tight financially. I had great plans on what financial independence would look like for our family, but it was looking less and less feasible. At work, well, you know what work is like. It's always crazy busy, and the salary just can't keep up with inflation. Now, I am not saying that Australia is this beautiful paradise with great nurse-to-patient ratio and fair pay, because it's not that, unfortunately. Well, at least the experience can vary depending on which state you'll work and what benefits your employer offers. But when we were doing our research and talking to some friends who moved to Australia, there is a real gap between the pay in New Zealand and Australia. And obviously, that's also because they are different, economically speaking. After all, Australia is a bigger country. My husband wanted to give this move a try. Try it while we're younger, he said. Honestly, in my younger years, I was more eager to move to Australia. I felt overwhelmed working as a nurse specialist in New Zealand, taking on increasing responsibilities with minimal improvement in pay. But after returning from maternity leave, I got a job as a nurse educator, and I finally felt that I was where I should be, and I didn't have the appetite to take on more risks. Is it really hot in Australia? Have you seen spiders and snakes? What about racism? Some people I know who went to Australia actually moved back to New Zealand. They don't treat New Zealanders as well as Australians get treated in New Zealand, right? Those were the many questions that I heard people ask, and they were the same questions I heard myself asking. So I was back at the drawing board, writing every pros and cons I can think of. Sitting on the floor, I imagined my 32-year-old self sitting next to my 21-year-old version. Are we really doing this again? On paper, moving to Australia made sense. It will provide better opportunity financially for my husband, more options for education, and eventually better career opportunities for my daughter. And I can still do YouTube as long as there's power and internet. So we made our move. I looked for nursing jobs in Australia. After I got my contract, I handed my resignation letter and cried a lot. I cried when I said goodbye to our nurse manager. I cried when I said goodbye to our service director. And they both said that I'll be fine, and I'd like to believe that I will be. The latter said to me, "Give it 6 months. If you really don't like it there, come back." For some context, Kiwis do travel to Australia. Some of the Kiwi nurses I know have worked in Australia before. Some still goes to work in Australia for short contracts. Some New Zealanders have family members living in Australia and vice versa. Australians have family members living in New Zealand, or at the very least, people in Australia will visit New Zealand for a vacation and vice versa. So I try to find comfort in knowing that New Zealand is not that far from Australia and that New Zealand will always be home for me and my family. My husband also handed his resignation letter, and fortunately, he also got a job in Australia. We sold our first property in New Zealand, and eventually we found a tenant for the property that we kept. We sold our cars and some of our belongings. Those that we can't sold, we gave away or threw out. For other things that we intended to keep, we boxed them and shipped them to Australia. I attended one last afternoon tea with other educators and a farewell dinner with my home ward because, as they say, things come in three, and at that time, there were 3 nurses leaving the ward. I went home with lots of presents: jade earrings and necklace, meal voucher and pocket money, farewell cards, and a heart-shaped ponamu. We landed at Brisbane Airport in the beginning of autumn 2022, and yes, it is really hot in Australia. It is very humid. I was like a fish swimming happily in the ocean until I jumped too high and somehow landed on a pavement. That's how the weather was like for me. But the warm weather also meant other things like mango, lots of mangoes, and sunshine. On our first week, we got our SIM cards, opened a bank account, applied for a tax file number or TFN, found a childcare service for my daughter, got a car loan for me and my husband, converted our New Zealand driver's license, applied for Medicare and childcare subsidy, and saw a bit of the CBD. On our second week here in Australia, I started working full-time while we're trying to find a rental accommodation. By the third week, we moved to a rental property, connected the utilities, power, water, internet. We registered in a GP practice and started adjusting to everyday traffic and work life in Australia. Honestly, I was just following my own moving to New Zealand checklist, but this time it was adapted for Australia. So I was ticking all the general boxes: tumabako, transportation, medical, GP, banking, accommodation, and communication. Everything was happening at the same time, and it was very stressful. I haven't seen the big spiders and poisonous snakes, but I have seen road signs cautioning to drive slowly and watch out for koalas. From time to time, I'll see posts in Facebook groups sharing photos of leftover scales from snakes shedding their skin. Other times, some will actually post videos of snakes just slithering their way on a neighborhood. But personally, I haven't encountered the big spiders or poisonous snakes, and I hope I'll never have to. Racism. Personally, I can say that I haven't experienced racism at work or in my day-to-day life. For sure, I had coworkers with challenging behaviors, but it was more to do with their personality than actual racism. At least that's what I think anyway. But don't get me wrong, there are people who experience discrimination because of how they look like, how they sound like, and it can really harm that person. That can happen in Australia and even in New Zealand. Check the description box below and I will leave a link to government websites which can give you more information about this matter. Overall, I worked with amazing and really kind people in New Zealand, but it doesn't mean that it was all perfect. There were other coworkers who can be confrontational and have all the seemingly logical excuses for unfair work allocation. So that was also happening. And for me, it took a while to actually find my voice in these situations. But if I compare my experience working in New Zealand versus Australia, for me, it was a lot easier to connect with my workmates in New Zealand. Kiwis and international nurses in New Zealand, while working with them, the connection was instant. In Australia, it's kind of like working in the Philippines where you are not easily trusting. You'll still get along in the end and eventually make friends, but I guess, at least in my experience, it wasn't as effortless in the beginning as I have experienced it in New Zealand. By now, I am probably making a fool of myself, generalizing individual experiences, so I do apologize for my ignorance. But just for context, for the 10 years that I lived in New Zealand, I worked in different places: Western Bay of Plenty, Tauranga, Hawke's Bay, Rotorua. I've been to Auckland, Hamilton, Whangarei, Queenstown, and Dunedin. And in those experiences, there were people who I definitely struggled getting along with, but there were more people that I easily connected with. And I think that instantaneous connection that I took for granted was the one thing that I missed the most. Now, don't get me wrong, eventually, after I grieved about this loss and started focusing on things that I can control, I did end up finding my people. I have been privileged to work with and teach amazing and hardworking nurses who are always so gracious, even under pressure. And the nurse managers of the wards that I looked after, they were so down to earth, approachable, and that helped me a lot. And within my own team, there were nurses that I look up to, people who were good at work and just good people. And when I was reflecting on this experience, my friend who I used to work with in New Zealand, and now she's also here in Australia, she said therein lied the difference. In her experience, New Zealanders easily open up, they are laid back, what you see is what you get. In Australia, because it is a big country, some people are more guarded with how they relate to other people. But once you build that relationship with them, the depth of connection is also similar. And then on the other side of the equation, there are just other people who I'll never understand, and I think that's okay. As a New Zealand citizen living in Australia, I am very grateful that I have access to childcare subsidy and Medicare. However, just know that there are government supports which are only given to Australian residents. So, for example, disability support pension, and also note that there are differences in what New Zealanders in Australia are entitled to versus what Australians in New Zealand are entitled to. I will actually leave a link in the description box about this information from Australian Parliament House, and do let me know in the comment section below if this is something that you'd like to be discussed further in this podcast. For my family, after renting in Brisbane for 7 months, we were lucky to find our first home in the Moreton Bay area, and our suburb is just 28 kilometers from Brisbane CBD. It is still hot and humid where we are. There's also flies on a day shift and mosquitoes in the afternoon shift, but honestly, that setup is pretty similar from where I was living in the Philippines. And don't be fooled by the IG photos. In New Zealand, especially during summer, flies are also very active. I am so sorry I am talking about flies and mosquitoes, but I just want to keep it real. Overall, Philippines, New Zealand, and Australia, they are all beautiful countries. You must check it out. What was it like moving to Australia? It was scary. We moved with our 2-year-old daughter in the middle of a pandemic, leaving certainty, routine, and our support people at work and outside of work. Some even said it will be tough because we will be starting from scratch again. But it was exciting. Moving to Australia felt like coming out of retirement. There's life after 5 o'clock, places to be, food to eat, and new people to meet. It felt like we were not starting from scratch, but rather we were starting from experience. It was sad. I missed our home, my coffee buddies, my window shopping routine where I'm not stuck in a traffic. Everything was conveniently accessible within 5 to 10 minutes drive, and where ironically, Kmart is open until 12 midnight. But seriously, I initially struggled at work because my first job in Australia was more clinically challenging. And although my immediate team and the nurses of the ward that I look after was really supportive, understanding, and grateful, I was working close enough to people who were not as supportive and who were even passive-aggressive. But it was happy. I was experiencing new things at work and outside of work. As a senior designated nurse, there was improvement in my pay, and I didn't have to work as many hours as I have worked in New Zealand. Although I started working full-time for my first job, for the next one, I was able to decrease my hours, be with my daughter more, and even do more of YouTube. Hit like and subscribe if you're liking this podcast. It was expensive. I didn't exactly know where to get cheaper things and services, and car parking fees, well, I am still not a fan, but it was priceless. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I didn't leave my hometown, if I carried on living and eventually working in a military base. I think I would still be happy. I tend to focus on the good things that are happening. I always tell myself that there is something to learn in every situation. But having experience living in a small town in the Philippines and eventually working in the capital and then finding my way to New Zealand then Australia, I have thoroughly enjoyed this process. I feel like it has helped me grow as an individual and really flourish in the opportunities that has come my way. I have met a lot of healthcare professionals in my 14 years as a registered nurse, and yet I am still in awe of how amazing these people are. They have big hearts, and I'm so privileged that I get to meet them and that I had a chance of working with them. I'd like to think that as a nurse, I am the sum of all the people I work with, and that when I stand professionally in a clinical environment, I am not only representing my own experience, rather, I am the reflection of the teachings and many experiences of the people I have worked with and learned from. Again, I am not sure if moving abroad is right for you, but for me, this has been a life-changing experience. Obviously, I owe this a lot to my family, my few friends, and to 15-year-old Veronica, who endured 4 years of studying nursing, and for finding the courage to venture to the unknown. Are you also moving to New Zealand or Australia? What are you most excited about? Let me know in the comment section below. If you think this podcast was helpful, share it. Share this information to a friend and check out my other podcast about moving to New Zealand during a pandemic. As always, I wish you all the best with your journey and I hope you will be blessed. I'll see you soon. Bye!